In the quiet solitude of her home, Margaret's bond with her dog deepened. Beyond the usual companionship of owner and pet, she found herself questioning the emotions stirring within her, and one night did something shocking. What was this? Watch till the end. I never thought the house could feel this empty. It had been quiet before, of course. Years of living alone had made me used to the stillness. But after Oliver was gone, the silence felt heavier, like a weight pressing down on me. I had always been independent, always managed just fine on my own, but losing Oliver changed something. He had been my companion for so many years, curling up beside me in the evenings, greeting me in the morning with his soft purring. Without him, the house didn't just feel quiet. It felt hollow, as if something essential had been taken away. I told myself it was just a cat, just an animal, and that I had lost much more important things in life, but the truth was, Oliver had been my comfort in the years after my husband passed. He had been the one constant thing in my life, and now, without him, I didn't know what to do with myself. The days stretched on, long and uneventful. I would wake up, make my coffee, sit by the window and watch the world move without me. I used to enjoy the peacefulness of my home in Vermont, the way the trees changed with the seasons, the way the distant sound of birds or the occasional passing car reminded me that I wasn't completely alone. But now, those things only made me more aware of how little I had to fill my time. My son, Daniel, called me often, checking in like he always did. But even he started to notice the change in my voice, the lack of energy in my words. "Mom, you need something to keep you company," he said one afternoon. "You've always had a pet. Maybe it's time to get another." I dismissed the idea at first. I was too old to take care of another animal. It wouldn't be the same. Nothing could replace Oliver. But the loneliness was getting harder to ignore. The days blurred together, and the nights felt even longer. The house, once filled with small sounds of movement, now felt frozen in time. I tried to push through it, tried to find comfort in books, in television, in hobbies I had once enjoyed, but none of it worked. The silence followed me everywhere. So, one day, almost without thinking, I found myself at the local animal shelter. The smell of dogs and cats, the sounds of barking and soft meowing filled the air as I walked through the rows of kennels. I told myself I was just looking, just considering, and then I saw him. A medium-sized dog with dark eyes that followed my every move. He was calm, quiet, different from the others who barked and jumped at the sight of visitors. When I stopped in front of his kennel, he simply wagged his tail and sat down, waiting. The tag on his cage said his name was Baxter. The volunteer told me he had been there for months, overlooked because he wasn't as energetic as the younger dogs. "He's a sweet boy," she said, scratching behind his ears. "Loyal. I think he just needs someone to give him a chance." I didn't know what made me say yes. Maybe it was the way he looked at me, like he understood. Maybe it was the thought of coming home to something alive again. Whatever it was, I found myself signing the adoption papers before I could change my mind. That night, for the first time in months, my house wasn't empty. Baxter followed me from room to room, never too close but always watching. When I sat down on the couch, he lay at my feet, his eyes soft and steady. It wasn't the same as having Oliver, but it was something. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel quite so alone. After Oliver passed, I never realized just how much noise he had brought into my life until it was gone. The sound of his soft paws against the wooden floor, the gentle purring when he curled up next to me, even the way he would flick his tail when something caught his attention. It had all been a part of my daily routine, and without it, the house felt unbearably empty. I tried to keep myself busy, reading books, watching television, even knitting like I used to when I was younger. But no matter what I did, the silence always crept back in. The loneliness felt heavier than before, and no matter how much I told myself that I had lived alone for years and had always been fine, I knew deep down that I wasn't fine anymore. I barely noticed how much I had withdrawn until my son Daniel started calling more often, his voice filled with concern. He asked about my days, what I had been doing, how I was feeling, and I always told him I was fine, that everything was normal, but I could tell he didn't believe me. One afternoon, after another short conversation where I had nothing to say because I hadn't done anything all day, he finally said what had clearly been on his mind for a while. "Mom, I think you should get a pet." I sighed, already knowing where this was going. "Daniel, I don't think that's a good idea. I'm too old to take care of an animal again." "You took care of Oliver just fine," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I know you miss having that companionship. You don't have to be alone, Mom." I wanted to argue, to say that it wasn't that simple, but the truth was, I didn't have a real reason to say no. I just didn't want to feel like I was replacing Oliver. Didn't want to pretend that getting another pet would suddenly fix the loneliness I felt. But Daniel wasn't giving up. The next time he visited, he brought up the idea again, this time with more insistence. "Just think about it," he said. "You don't have to decide right now. But maybe you could just go look at the shelter, see if there's a dog that feels right." I told him I'd think about it, though I wasn't sure if I actually meant it. But after another long week of waking up to an empty house, of sitting in the quiet with no one to talk to, I found myself considering it more seriously. Maybe Daniel was right. Maybe I did need something, someone, to keep me company. And so, with hesitation, I drove to the local animal shelter. The moment I stepped inside, I was greeted by the sound of barking, whining, and the rustling of animals moving in their cages. A friendly volunteer approached me, asking if I needed help, and when I explained that I was looking for a quiet, calm dog, she smiled and led me toward a different section of the shelter. "I think I have the perfect dog for you," she said. When we stopped in front of a kennel, I saw him. A medium-sized dog with brown fur and deep, soulful eyes. He wasn't jumping or barking like the other dogs. He just sat there, watching me with quiet curiosity, his tail wagging slowly. His tag read, Baxter. The volunteer knelt beside him, scratching his ears. "He's been here a while. People usually overlook him because he's not as energetic as the younger dogs, but he's got a heart of gold." I didn't know what it was about him that made me pause, but something in those eyes reminded me of the quiet understanding Oliver used to have. When the volunteer led him out of the kennel, he walked up to me slowly, sniffing my hand before sitting beside me as if he had already decided that I belonged to him. Something in my chest softened, and before I could second-guess myself, I said, "I think I'd like to take him home." The process didn't take long, and before I knew it, I was driving home with Baxter sitting in the back seat, his head resting on the window as he watched the world go by. When we got to the house, I expected him to be nervous, to need time to adjust. But instead, he simply walked in and lay down by the couch as if he had always been there. I sat down beside him, running my fingers through his fur, feeling the quiet comfort of having another living presence in the house again. It wasn't the same as Oliver, but maybe that was okay. Maybe this was exactly what I needed. When I brought Baxter home, I wasn't sure what to expect. It had been years since I had owned a dog, and I worried that I wouldn't be able to take care of him properly. I told myself he was just a pet, just an animal to keep me company so the house wouldn't feel so empty. But I didn't realize how quickly he would become something more. At first, he was quiet, just following me around the house at a distance, observing me as if he was still unsure about his new home. I gave him space, not wanting to overwhelm him, but after a few days, he started inching closer. He would sit by my chair when I had my morning coffee, curl up near my feet when I read in the afternoon, and watch me from the doorway whenever I moved from room to room. He wasn't demanding, wasn't loud or needy. He was just there, always watching, always waiting, always present. It was comforting in a way I hadn't expected. I thought he would be a distraction, something to fill the silence, but instead, it felt like he was actually listening, as if he understood more than I had given him credit for. The first time I realized Baxter was different was on an evening that had felt particularly heavy. It had been 6 months since Oliver passed, and no matter how much I tried to move forward, the loneliness still crept up on me when I least expected it. I was sitting on the couch, staring at an old photograph, my heart aching in a way I thought I had gotten used to. But this time, it felt harder. I didn't realize I had started crying until I felt a warm nudge against my hand. I looked down to see Baxter staring up at me, his dark eyes filled with something I couldn't quite explain. He wasn't wagging his tail, wasn't trying to play. He was just there, looking at me like he understood. Before I knew it, he climbed onto the couch beside me, something he had never done before, and rested his head on my lap. I ran my fingers through his fur, feeling the warmth of his body, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel quite so alone. It wasn't just that moment either. As the days went on, I started noticing the little things. The way he would stay close when I felt down, the way he would nudge my hand when I got lost in my thoughts, the way he always seemed to sense when I needed comfort before I even realized it myself. He became more than just a pet. He became my shadow, my quiet companion, my unexpected source of strength. I never thought a dog could understand human emotions, but Baxter proved me wrong. He didn't need words, didn't need explanations. He just knew. And as I sat there, feeling the warmth of his presence beside me, I realized that maybe, just maybe, he was exactly what I had been missing all along. I didn't notice it at first. Baxter was just my dog, my companion, my comfort on lonely nights. He had filled the silence in my house, given me something to care for, something to wake up for in the morning. At first, it was small things. How I found myself talking to him more often, how his presence felt like enough to get me through the day. I convinced myself it was normal. People talk to their pets all the time. There was nothing strange about that. But as the months went on, I started to realize just how much I depended on him, how much my world had started to shrink. I had always been independent, had always prided myself on handling life alone. I had lost my husband, had lost Oliver, had managed to keep going even when the loneliness became unbearable. But now, instead of pushing myself to move forward, I found myself retreating into a world where it was just me and Baxter. My son Daniel would call, and I would let it go to voicemail, telling myself I'd call back later, and then never doing it. Friends from the book club would invite me out, but I would make excuses, preferring to stay home where everything felt safe and predictable. I didn't even realize I was doing it at first. It just became easier. Baxter never asked for anything. never expected me to talk or explain myself, never pushed me to step outside my comfort zone. He was always there, always ready to listen, always looking at me with those understanding eyes that made me feel like I didn't need anyone else. But then one evening, Daniel showed up unannounced. He knocked on the door, and for a moment, I thought about pretending I wasn't home. But Baxter wagged his tail excitedly, running to the door, and I knew I couldn't ignore my own son. I opened it, forcing a smile. Daniel, what a surprise. He stepped inside, looking around the house, then at me. Mom, when's the last time you left the house? The question caught me off guard, and I let out a nervous laugh. Oh, I go out all the time. He frowned. Really? Because every time I call, you're here. The last time Sarah invited you over for dinner, you canceled. You haven't been to the book club in months. I waved a hand dismissively. I've just been busy, and honestly, I like being home. It's peaceful. Daniel looked at Baxter, who was sitting by my feet, watching us like he always did. Mom? I think you're isolating yourself. I opened my mouth to argue, but the words didn't come. Because deep down, I knew he was right. I had stopped making an effort, had stopped trying to connect with people because it was easier to just exist in the small world I had built for myself. And the worst part was, I wasn't sure if I even wanted to change it. I'm fine, I finally said, but my voice didn't sound convincing, not even to myself. Daniel sighed, shaking his head. I just don't want you to be alone, Mom. I looked down at Baxter, who nudged my hand as if to remind me that I wasn't alone. But in that moment, I realized something. As much as I loved Baxter, as much as he had been there for me in ways I couldn't even put into words, he wasn't a replacement for human connection. He couldn't be. I had let myself believe that he was enough, that I didn't need anyone else. But now I wasn't so sure. That night, as I sat on the couch with Baxter curled up beside me, I couldn't shake Daniel's words. Had I really withdrawn that much? Had I really let my whole world shrink down to just me and this dog? I thought about calling Daniel, about reaching out to Sarah, about saying yes the next time a friend invited me somewhere. But I didn't move. I just sat there, running my fingers through Baxter's fur, feeling more uncertain than I had in a long time. That night, I lay awake thinking about what Daniel had said, about how I had slowly started to isolate myself without even realizing it. I had convinced myself that staying home with Baxter was enough, that I didn't need anyone else, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I thought about all the invitations I had ignored, the calls I had let go to voicemail, the friends I had slowly stopped reaching out to. It wasn't that I didn't care about them. It was just easier to stay in my routine, to wake up, drink my coffee, take Baxter for a walk, come home, and let the days pass without much change. But now that I was forced to think about it, I realized how small my world had become. I didn't want Daniel to worry about me. Didn't want him to think I was wasting away in my house with only my dog for company. And the truth was, I missed them. I missed my family. Missed the sound of laughter over dinner. Missed the simple joy of spending time with people who knew me, who loved me. So the next morning, I made a decision. I picked up the phone and called Daniel. He sounded surprised to hear from me, and I could tell he was expecting me to brush him off like I usually did. But instead, I asked him when I could come over for dinner. There was a pause, and then I heard the smile in his voice when he said, "How about tonight?" That evening, I drove to Daniel's house for the first time in months. Sarah was there, along with my grandchildren, and the moment I walked in, I felt something inside me loosen. The house was warm, filled with the smell of something cooking in the oven, filled with voices and laughter, and life. I had forgotten how good it felt to be around people, to be part of something bigger than just myself. The kids ran up to me, hugging me tightly, and I felt a lump rise in my throat. How had I let so much time pass? We ate dinner together, and I actually found myself enjoying it, laughing at their stories, feeling like I belonged again. And the best part was, Baxter was right there with me. He lay by my feet, content, as if he knew that this was where we were meant to be. After that night, I made more of an effort. I started saying yes more often, started reaching out instead of waiting for others to reach out to me. I went back to my book club, nervous at first, but as soon as I sat down with the other women, I realized how much I had missed it. We talked about the novels we were reading, shared stories, laughed over cups of tea, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like myself again. I visited Sarah more, went out for coffee with old friends, took walks in the park just to be around people, to remind myself that the world was still there, waiting for me. Through it all, Baxter remained by my side. He was still my constant companion, my source of comfort, but I no longer relied on him to be my whole world. I had learned that while his love was unconditional, while he was always there when I needed him, I couldn't close myself off from the rest of my life. I needed balance, needed connection, needed more than just the quiet safety of my home. And slowly, I was finding it again. It didn't happen all at once, but little by little, I started feeling like myself again. At first, every time I went out, every time I said yes to an invitation, I felt like I was forcing it. I had spent so much time alone, wrapped in my quiet little world with Baxter, that being around people again felt unfamiliar. But the more I did it, the easier it became. I visited Daniel and Sarah more often, let my grandkids pull me into their endless stories about school and friends and the latest things that made them laugh. I went to book club regularly, found myself looking forward to the discussions, to the simple pleasure of sharing thoughts and opinions over cups of tea. I started taking longer walks with Baxter, not just in our neighborhood, but through the town, through the park, even by the lake where I used to sit with a book before I convinced myself that I didn't need to go out anymore. And with every step, every conversation, every moment spent outside of my own head, I felt lighter. I still had my quiet moments, of course. There were still days when I missed Oliver, when the house felt just a little too empty, when I felt that familiar ache of loneliness creeping back in. But instead of retreating into myself, I reached out. I called Daniel just to chat. I sent a message to a friend from book club. I took Baxter to the dog park and let myself strike up a conversation with other pet owners, something I never would have done before. And the more I did it, the more I realized that I wasn't alone, that I had never been alone. Not really. Baxter was still my companion, my loyal shadow. But he was no longer the only thing anchoring me. He had been there when I needed him most, had pulled me through my darkest moments. But now, he was part of a bigger picture, a life that felt full again. I had found balance, had learned that healing didn't come from shutting the world out, but from letting it back in, from allowing myself to be part of something again. And as I sat in my backyard one afternoon, watching the sun set with Baxter lying at my feet, I felt at peace. Not just with him, not just with my life, but with myself. I had found my way back, and I knew deep in my heart that I was exactly where I was meant to be. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and before I knew it, I had settled into a new rhythm, one that felt natural and whole. My mornings were no longer spent in silence with just a cup of coffee and my thoughts. I had Baxter by my side, but I also had phone calls from Daniel, messages from friends, and plans that filled my days with warmth. I had once believed that loneliness was something I had to accept, something inevitable as the years passed, but I had been wrong. Loneliness wasn't about being alone, it was about closing yourself off, about believing that the world had nothing left for you. And now I knew better. I had people who cared, people who wanted me in their lives, and for the first time in a long time, I was letting them in. Baxter remained my faithful companion, always watching me with those knowing eyes, always by my side, no matter what. But I no longer clung to him as my only source of comfort. Instead, he became a part of my new life, the same way my family and friends were. He was there when I sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the world slow down as the sun dipped behind the trees. He was there when I went to book club, waiting patiently by my side as I chatted with the other members after our meetings. He was there when I visited Daniel's house, curling up at my feet as my grandchildren played around us, filling the room with laughter. He had become a thread woven into the fabric of my life, not the whole picture, but an important piece of it. There were still quiet moments, still nights when I found myself missing the past, missing Oliver, missing the years that had slipped away so quickly. But those moments no longer felt unbearable. I had learned that grief doesn't disappear, but it softens, it changes, it makes room for new things. It had led me here, to this moment, to this life where I was no longer just existing, but truly living again. I had thought that adopting Baxter was just a way to fill the silence, to keep myself occupied. But he had done so much more than that. He had reminded me that I was capable of love, of connection, of opening my heart again. One evening, as I sat outside watching the sky turn shades of pink and orange, Baxter rested his head on my lap, and I smiled, running my fingers through his fur. "We did all right, didn't we?" I whispered, and his tail thumped in response. I knew he didn't understand my words, but he understood me, just as he always had. I had found my way back to the world, back to the people who loved me, back to myself. And for the first time in a long time, I felt whole. The seasons changed, and with them, so did I. Autumn came with its crisp air and golden leaves, and I found myself taking longer walks, enjoying the simple pleasure of watching the world shift around me. Baxter trotted happily beside me, sniffing at the fallen leaves, his tail wagging as if every new scent was a discovery worth celebrating. I let myself enjoy those moments, realizing that I no longer walked just to fill the time. I walked because I wanted to, because I enjoyed it, because it made me feel alive. Winter followed, bringing shorter days and colder nights. But even then, my house no longer felt as empty as it once had. I spent the holidays with Daniel and Sarah, surrounded by the warmth of family, the laughter of my grandchildren echoing through the house. It had been years since I had felt that sense of belonging, and I soaked in every moment, knowing how easily I could have missed it. Baxter fit right into our family gatherings, curling up near the fireplace, receiving endless belly rubs from the kids, his presence as much a part of the home as mine. As the months passed, I realized that somewhere along the way, the ache of loneliness had faded. It hadn't disappeared completely. Grief and solitude leave their marks, shaping us in ways we don't always understand. But it no longer controlled me. I no longer felt trapped in my own home, no longer felt like life was something that was passing me by. I had found my way back to the world, and I had learned that healing wasn't about forgetting the past or forcing myself to move on. It was about making space for new joy, new love, new memories. One afternoon, as spring began to bloom, I sat in my backyard, a book in my hands and Baxter lying at my feet, soaking in the sun. I thought about how different things had felt a year ago, how lost I had been, how much I had let my world shrink. And now, here I was, feeling content, feeling whole. I knew there would still be days when the loneliness crept in, but I also knew I had the tools to face it. I had my family, my friends, my books, my morning walks, my afternoons at the library, and the simple joy of watching the world move around me. I had Baxter, my constant, my loyal friend, but he was no longer my only source of comfort. He was part of a life that was filled with so much more. As I looked at him, he lifted his head, his brown eyes meeting mine, and I smiled. "We did all right, didn't we?" I said softly, repeating the words I had spoken months ago. This time, I didn't ask it as a question. I already knew the answer. Baxter wagged his tail, as if agreeing with me, and I let out a small laugh. The world had changed, and so had I. And for the first time in a long time, I was exactly where I was meant to be.